Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. Verse 12. The subject, the last part of 3 and most of 4, has to do with the subject of God's rest. And it's got a lot of little nuances to it, and we're going to kind of walk slowly through the history of the idea of the giving of rest by God, and hopefully by the time we get to the end of it, we'll have some understanding of what He has offered and what He is offering in rest. But we'll start in verse 12. Right? See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We've come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. As has just been said, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? And with whom was He angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter His rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Therefore, since the promise of entering His rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet His works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere He has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day God rested from all His works. And again in the passage above He says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This He did when a long time later He spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from His. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So I don't know if you noticed, but the Hebrew writer is very interested in the concept of today. Right? He takes that one word out of that psalm and goes over it and over it and over it to make sure that we understand that the hope of the rest, the offer of the rest, is made today. So it was made a long time ago when it was there today. It was made in the time of David when he was writing the Psalms, when it was there today. And it was made in the New Testament era when it was there today. And now, of course, it's offered to us in our current time. It is today for us. So the promise of entering His rest still remains. And he hits two of the leaders in the same passage. He starts out with Moses. We talked about that last week. Moses wasn't able to get all of the people from Egypt all the way into the promised land. So he's not as good as Jesus, because Jesus can get us into the promise. And then he mentions Joshua. Out of all the people that were in that older generation that died off in the wilderness in those 40 years, just Joshua and Caleb entered into the promised land. But Joshua could not give them rest. Even with his great leadership and the amazing things that God did in bringing them into Canaan, they still were disobedient. They still were unbelieving people. So I want us to go all the way back to Genesis and talk about the idea of there being a day in which God invites us into his rest. And we'll start with Genesis 1. Let's go 27. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was an evening and there was a morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. But by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. In Genesis 1, there is a pattern of creation. God says something. Something happens in response to what he said. Let there be light, and there was light. God said, let the land bring forth the plants, and the land brought forth the plants. So God speaks, something happens in response to it, and then there's a quality control verse. God looked at the land, and he saw that it was good. And finally, there's a time frame. There was an evening, and there was a morning the first day. There was an evening, there was a morning the second day. All the way through, he's created animals and man. And it says at the end of the sixth day, and there was an evening and there was a morning the sixth day. Did you notice when you get into chapter 2, and it talks about God's day of rest, the Sabbath, the seventh day, it never says there was an evening and a morning the seventh day. So to the mind of the rabbis, the teachers of Israel, God never stopped resting. He finished what he was doing. And so he entered into his rest. And since he was in his place of rest, he could invite other people to come in and enjoy that rest with him. So that was their theology. That was their understanding that God had finished creating and now was able to invite people to rest in his rest, the work having been completed. Think about Adam and Eve. God forms a garden, and we get all the geography of the thing and how beautiful it was, and God planted this garden, and he makes Adam from the dust of the ground, and he puts him in the garden to take care of the garden. What did Adam do to make the place where he was given to rest? Nothing, right? God makes a garden. God makes a man. God gives man the place to be in the garden. Right? Beautiful paradise of God already prepared. He goes into it. He creates the woman, or he makes the woman out of the man. The man and the woman sin. They can no longer stay in the place of rest. What was their sin? At its very core, what did they do? Other than just God said don't eat the fruit and they ate it. What was their sin? Disobedience, but their disobedience was rooted in something else. Their disobedience was rooted in unbelief. The serpent came and told Eve, have you been told that you can eat every fruit in the garden? She says, well, we can eat everything except the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent said, well, the reason God doesn't want you to eat that is because if you eat it, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, you have a choice. You can be obedient to God and trust God that he'll take care of you, or you can decide that you need to know. And Eve decided that it was good to the eye, and it was good for food, and it was good to make one wise. So instead of trusting God, she trusted the serpent. She ate the fruit. She gave it to Adam. Adam trusted Eve, who trusted the serpent. And they eat. They get kicked out of the garden. Why? They can't stay in the place of rest if they're unbelieving. So Adam and Eve get booted out because of unbelief. Look over at Exodus chapter 20. Anybody have bells and whistles go off when you say Exodus 20? That should be one of those that immediately makes sense to you. That's the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20. Verse 8 is where we're going to start. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And by the way, it's easy to think that Sabbath and seventh are the same word. They're not. Sabbath actually means rest. So when he says remember the Sabbath day, he's saying remember the day of rest. Most Sabbaths, the usual Sabbath was on the seventh day, but it was on the seventh day that God took Sabbath. He took his rest. So he invited people into his rest on the seventh day. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male, nor your female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, the day of rest, and made it holy. So it was an enforceable law among the Jews in the wilderness, and later, of course, when they got into the land of Canaan. The test case came up when there was a man who was out on the day of rest gathering sticks, and they had to decide, what do we do with this man who's violating the day of rest? And the eventual edict was, we stone him to death. Right, so it was not a suggestion. It was an absolute law. But the reasoning behind the law is, I rested, so you can rest. I've brought you up out of Egypt. Now you can take your rest. Deuteronomy 5 is more specific in that area. Deuteronomy 5, beginning in verse 12. And we're going to skip down to verse 15. The first part of it is the same. 6 days you will work, do all your labor, but on the seventh day it's holy to the Lord. Verse 15 says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you up out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the rest day, the Sabbath day. So reason number one given in Exodus is, I worked for 6 days and I entered my rest. Now you can enter my rest with me. And the second reason is more specific. You were slaves in Egypt. You had no rest. And I rescued you. So now you can. You can do all your work in the 6 days, but on that seventh day, I want you to rest. Take a time of rest. And the general idea was, remember me. Trust in me. Think about what I've done for you. I've given you life. I've given you freedom. I've given you a place. He makes promises to them about how they're going to live in houses that they didn't build, and they're going to eat from orchards that they didn't plant, because he's going to give them the land of plenty. They get to the border of the land of plenty, and they can't trust God enough to take it. We see it. It's beautiful. Remember the passage that talks about they brought some grapes back on a pole, and they had to drape the grape over the pole because they were so full, so bountiful. They were like, it's the most amazing place we've ever seen. But we can't take it because the people are so huge and the cities are so fortified. They didn't have trust. They didn't have faith. And because of that, God says, well, if you don't believe I can give it to you, then I'm not going to give it to you. And so they were unable to have the things that God had prepared for them. I've got one more passage down here. I've got Numbers chapter 13. Oh, in verse 30, this is when they had come back from looking at the land. Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land. We can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. They spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those who are living in it. All the people we saw are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and I'm sure we looked the same to them. So we can't do it. So they told people, don't trust God. Trust us. Caleb says, trust God. If he said he could give it to us, let's go take it. Let's start right now. So Joshua and Caleb, 2 out of those 10, vote yes, let's go. The other 10, 2 out of the 12, the other 10 say, no, we can't do it. Look at Matthew chapter 11. Jesus chimes in on this idea. And until you think about it in terms of what the Hebrew writer is talking about, you may not connect these passages, but see if this doesn't fit. Matthew 11:27 is where we're going to start. Jesus says, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So God sent Jesus for the purpose of opening up this new opportunity for human beings to have rest. The people of Israel didn't take it, so it was still available. The Hebrew writer says it's still available today. So those of you that have entered into this hope, who have come in by faith and trusted God, now that you're getting into a situation where there's difficulties, where there's threats, where it seems like maybe you're going to be persecuted, don't let that back you off. You'll be just like those folks in the desert looking over into Canaan saying, well, it's beautiful, but we can't take it. You're saying, well, our relationship with Jesus is beautiful, but it's going to get me beat up. So I've got to get rid of this and hang on to this. I trust me. I trust my relationship with Judaism perhaps more than I trust my relationship with God through Jesus. So I'm going to just kind of back off of this faith in Messiah and not take the punishment that it would take to remain faithful. So the Hebrew writer, again, over and over, uses that word, today. It was today for Adam. It was today for the Israelites. It was today in David's time. It was today in the first century church's time. It's today in our time. We have to decide, do we believe him or don't we? Now, what's the promise that he's made? If you'll trust me, I'll give you everlasting life. If you'll hang on to that trust until the end, then I'll give you a great reward. When you read the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation, there's that recurring theme. If you're faithful unto death, if you hang on to your faith until the end, I'm going to give you gifts. Don't let go of your faith. The faith is the thing that holds you into God's rest. So if eternal life is at question, to enter God's rest eternally, is there rest before that? When we enter into Christ, when we're added to his church, when does the rest start? Here's some thoughts. We're tempted to try to fortify our own position for salvation rather than trusting Christ and his blood for our salvation. I know for me personally that's always been a problem. I see that he says, I have done the work, and now you can enter into the rest. But my heart says, yeah, but I've got to be good enough long enough to be worthy of it. Right? So somehow I've got to be able to win the battles and make everything work so that I can be worthy of the rest. God says, be obedient, but you're not being given the rest because of what you're doing. You're being given the rest because of what I did. Adam didn't get the garden because he somehow created himself and earned the garden. He got the garden because God created him and created the garden and said, here, be in the garden. The Israelites would have had zero chance of getting across the Red Sea, across the desert to Canaan, and just battling their way into the land. God said, I'm going to give you the land. I'll lead you to it, and I'll give it to you. And that first generation said, well, we don't think you can. We don't think you can follow through on the promise. And some of us, myself included, at least go through phases, if not with an ongoing problem, that we kind of say to God, I know you say you can save me, but I know me pretty good. I know my problems. I know my faults. I know that I'm not good enough. And God's not asking us to be good enough. He's asking us to be faithful enough to believe that he really can do what he said he could do. It's all about faith. And there is a danger in emphasizing too much what we do, how we live our lives, but there's a part of me that's scared to death to underemphasize it as well. Do we ever get to a point where we just say, well, that God's going to give us this rest no matter what we do, no matter how we act? The Hebrew writer continually warns his readers that if they really believe God, they'll live faithful lives. If they believe that the rest is theirs, then they're going to live a lifestyle that's indicative of that. They're not going to go back into the world. They're not going to go back and just try to live for themselves, but they're going to live for God. I guess it's back to that old adage, we don't live the Christian life so we can be saved. We live the Christian life because we are. So we've been given something amazing, and because we've been given that amazing thing, we live a certain lifestyle, or at least we certainly try to. Any thoughts or additions to that? This is one of my favorite subjects, by the way. If you didn't notice, I've done a lot of writing on it and a lot of study on it. It's a really neat concept that all through human history, God has been saying, why won't you let me give you something? Why won't you let me give you the perfect thing? Why won't you just allow me to be God and let you be my people? And all through history, there have been some that have bought into it and lived faithfully, and there have been some that said, no, I don't think you can deliver. We don't trust us enough to trust him. And so we take away from his perfection by our worry about our imperfection.
I think James chapter 2 is the one that kind of throws me off with you still, faith without works. You still have to be justified by your works.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, verse 24.
Absolutely.
And there's a mixture of it, I guess, as well.
Yeah. What David is saying, that James chapter 2, where he talks about you've got to show your faith by your works. So just saying I believe, but not having it change your life at all, is not what we're looking for either. It's interesting that the audiences for the book of Hebrews and the book of James were very similar audiences. They're Jewish Christians that have taken on Messiah and are living Christian lives, but from a Jewish background. So they're both writing to the same group. And the Hebrew writer doesn't let them off easy either. I mean, we're going to run into some passages that are pretty specific, that you need to have a lifestyle that mirrors what God has done for you. If not, then the question is, do you really believe him? If you really believed him, it would change your life. It would change the way you approach living. And we can always compare up. I know people that I consider to be far more holy than me. We don't do as well if we try to compare down. Surely we can find somebody that's worse off than we are. But we've got to keep our focus on Messiah, not on anybody else. Do you have anything else, Dave? Anybody else? All right, we'll tell you guys bye.